All right, hello everybody. My name's Gabe D'Antonio. I'm a senior and a policy debater, and today we're going to talk about counterplans. So we're going to start with sort of what a counterplan is, then discuss sort of the negative approach to counterplans before getting into the affirmative answers to counterplans. So let's start with a little bit of history lesson. So in original policy debate, instead of having plans, people would defend the entire resolution. So on this year's topic with criminal justice, you would have to be sort of defending criminal justice reform as a whole. Obviously, they wrote topics a little bit differently back then, so that would make more sense. But there were no counterplans back then because they didn't make any sense. But when we moved to the legislative model, which is what we have now, where the affirmative team brings up a proposal that affirms the resolution, suddenly, counterplans began to make sense. Specifically, in the legislative model of debate, where the affirmative team is presenting a plan that meets the resolution, a counterplan is a reason to reject the affirmative team's plan because there is a better option available. That's your counterplan. So if we were in Congress and somebody wanted me to pass one bill that, say, reforms college tuition spending and student debt, then a good reason not to pass it might be there's another bill that we're going to vote on tomorrow, and it's way better. So vote no on this one, vote yes on the other. So once you get into sort of the legislative model of debate, that's where counterplans begin to take shape. So what are the parts of a counterplan? So in the current model of debate, there are a couple of important parts of the counterplan. First, there's the counterplan text. This is just like a plan text, except for the negative. It needs both an actor and an action. So you could say the 50 states should form a compact and refuse to accept militarized gear for their police. Or you could say the Supreme Court should rule that shooting at moving cars is unconstitutional. Those are two examples of texts of counterplans, not particularly good ones, but they would absolutely work. Next, you need solvency. Hopefully, you're going to have an author saying that your counterplan text is going to work. In particular, you want it to at least solve some affirmative impacts and perhaps solve some new ones. That's called an internal net benefit. So much like on the affirmative side, when you're creating a plan, you need a text and solvency. Same thing with a counterplan. You need a text and you need solvency. The next important part of counterplans is competition. So the purpose of competition is to prove that the counterplan and the plan cannot actually happen together. After all, in the legislative model of debate, if we jump back to that, if you have one bill about, say, student debt and one bill about, say, college tuition, and you could argue that they both solve the same harms, but there's no reason why you can't reform both of them. So those would not be competitive. There are two main ways that a counterplan can create competition. The first is being mutually exclusive. For example, you could have one plan reduce funding to police agencies by 50%, and another plan increase funding to police agencies by 50%. You can't do both of those things. Excuse me. The truth is, mutually exclusive is incredibly powerful, but it's hard to get. These are often going to happen in the form of plan-inclusive counterplans, which we'll get to later. Next, the much more common way to have competition is through a net benefit. So we've already talked about disadvantages. If you don't remember what disadvantages are, go back and watch the video about disadvantages. And if there's a disadvantage that links to the affirmative team's plan, but not to the negative counterplan, that can achieve competition. Again, if we think about this legislative model of debate, we're sitting in Congress and we're deciding on two different ways to reform the criminal justice system that are both solving the same problem, say like racist drug arrests. And one of those solutions causes some serious problems and the other one doesn't. We're obviously going to go with the one that doesn't. And why would we bother to vote for both of these plans if you're solving it well enough with one and adding the second one on would just cause extra problems? So mutual exclusivity and net benefits are the two ways that a counterplan is going to compete, and it needs to compete. The final part of a counterplan is the status. This isn't going to come up in a lot of your rounds, but there are three main status. There's conditional, which means that the negative team can stop going for the counterplan and defend a different advocacy instead. So let's say I'm the negative team, I run a disadvantage, say a federalism disadvantage, and I run a 50 states counterplan. So if I have a conditional counterplan, I can say in the 2NR, be like, we're not going to go for the counterplan. Instead, we're just defending the status quo, and we're going to use our federalism disad, and we think that that is the best option. So conditional means you can kick it. You can get rid of it at any point in the round, say you're no longer defending it. Next, there's unconditional. So an unconditional counterplan makes sense. It's the opposite of conditional. You can't kick it. If you have an unconditional advocacy, that is your new advocacy for the round. So you're not defending the status quo. You're just defending your plan, an unconditional new plan. So obviously you can only have one unconditional advocacy because that's what you're stuck to. Next, there's dispositional. People argue about what a dispo counterplan actually means. But generally it means that you can kick it, but only under certain conditions. And whenever a team says that they have a dispositional counterplan, you should ask them under what conditions they can kick it. And hopefully they should be able to tell you. Never use dispo, just use condo or uncondo. Dispo adds extra effort that we really don't need to spend. So 99% of the time, if someone asks you status of your counterplan, you want to say condo. If you're running a counterplan and like this is your whole strategy, maybe it can be unconditional. But with a counterplan, just make it condo. We'll talk about condo theory in a later lecture, which is like the only reason you might want to go unconditional. But it's really not too big of a deal. Other parts of counterplans don't really matter as much anymore. In the olden days, they used to really worry about a counterplan being non-topical. Now plenty of counterplans are topical. So you might find some people arguing that there are other parts to a counterplan that you're missing. You're probably not. You're probably fine. So now let's pretend we're negative, and we're going to talk about the strategy of a counterplan. Why do we want to read counterplans? So there are a couple of ways. There are two big ones. The first one is to take out the affirmative team's impacts. So if you remember our previous lectures on advantages and disadvantages, the affirmative team is going to win through impacts 99% of the time. Let's say they have a mandatory minimums AF and they have a mass incarceration advantage. And part of that advantage is talking about how terrible it is that there's so many people in jail, right? So you could run a counter plan that in some way removes some of those people from jail or makes it okay that they're in jail. Any counter plan that fixes the same problem that the AF is trying to fix. So you could say like counter plan, like, I don't know, abolish prisons. And then there's nobody in jail. So if you do the counter plan and abolish prisons, there's nobody in jail, you have suddenly solved the affirmative team's advantage of mass incarceration. So that's the big reason people run counter plans. It's to get rid of affirmative impacts. The second reason that people will run counter plans is to focus the debate on a particular question. There are two main ways that people will do this, either by running a counter plan that does basically the same thing as the AF, but changes one small section of it, and then you can debate which of those is better. Or you could do what's called a polarized counter plan, where you sort of do the opposite of what they're doing and really focus the debate around that core ideological difference. So that's a lot less common, but it's technically possible. And we'll talk more about those different types of counter plans next. There are other strategic uses of the counter plan. You know, uniqueness counter plans are there to sort of shore up your disads. But the important one, take out AF impacts. The secondary one, to focus the debate on a specific issue. Whenever you're reading a counter plan on neg, ask yourself what you're trying to do with that counter plan. 9 times out of 10, you're trying to take out AF impacts. Occasionally, you're trying to focus the debate. Now, let's talk about the types of counter plans that you have available to you when you are reading a counter plan. So first, we're going to talk about the sort of most powerful, most common counter plans. Not all of them are 100% accepted as sort of legitimate. There are fair debates to be had, but I'm going to try to start with sort of the more legitimate ones and move to the less legitimate ones in this sort of holy pantheon of really good counter plans. So let's start with the advantage counter plan. This is undeniably fair, and this type of counter plan is exactly what we were talking about with the sort of abolish prisons versus mandatory minimums world, where you run a counterplan. It's unrelated to the plan text. Instead, it's related to the impacts. So it's a counterplan that solves an impact, right? They have a nuke war impact, and you read an advantage counterplan about like the New START treaty with Russia that's going to prevent us from having nuclear weapons, and then boom, no nuclear war. So advantage counterplans, they're very explicitly taking out an affirmative team's impact. They're taking out that advantage. They can be really helpful if, you know, especially in sort of bigger stick rounds with larger impacts. Maybe your disads aren't big enough to deal with some of these impacts, like nuclear war. The Ledoux team, we often don't have a lot of disads that go out that far. So you run an advantage counterplan that sort of solves that problem, and then you read a disad that outweighs because the problem has already been solved. The next type of counterplan that is almost certainly the most common is the actor counterplan. So if a text for a plan has both an actor and an action, say the United States federal government should end the 1033 program, an actor counterplan says, we like your plan, but we think somebody else should do it. So famous examples of this, the 50 states counterplan. That's big on a lot of topics. You say counterplan, the 50 states should work together and do essentially the exact same thing as the plan. Other big examples of that, the courts counterplan. We go, yeah, I like your plan text, but what if the Supreme Court did it instead? Or maybe they're a Supreme Court AF, and you say, whoa. What if the legislature did it instead? They do legislature? Well, what if the executive did it? Actor counterplans can be super helpful because they very effectively both take out affirmative impacts and focus the debate. So if you imagine a world where they're like, the Supreme Court should, you know, rule the death penalty unconstitutional, and you read a counterplan, an actor counterplan that says the Supreme Court, God, no. Obviously, the legislature should rule that the death penalty is illegal. This has some crazy good benefits. First of all, it should solve pretty much the whole AF. Unless they've got a lot of really Supreme Court specific solvency evidence, the simple fact that the government is saying, okay, no more death penalties, that probably means no more death penalties. However, now you're freed up to read a disadvantage to the court's part. So you could read, say, a hollow hope disad that goes against action in the courts. And that's a pretty dang good strategy right there. So with actor counterplans, you're almost always going to get your competition through a net benefit. And that net benefit is almost always a disad to the actor that they were originally using. Okay, so that is advantage counterplans and actor counterplans. Next, there are plan-inclusive counterplans, or PICs. These are sly little counterplans. A lot of people hate them. For good reason, but they are quite powerful, and it's important to know what they are, if only so that when you construct your AFs, you don't make AFs that can easily get picked. So one example on this year is a lot of the mandatory minimum AFs. They'll say, you know, get rid of all mandatory minimums. And then you could read a PIC, a plan-inclusive counterplan, that includes some of, but not all of that advocacy. So you could say counterplan, we should end mandatory minimums for everything except for sex crimes, right? We're doing basically the same thing as the AF, except we're stopping just a little bit short. There are tons and tons and tons of ways that you can do this on any topic. On the arms sales topic, if the AF was, you know, get rid of weapons to Saudi Arabia, you could say, get rid of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia, keep defensive weapons. The year before that with immigration, they say, let in these people. You say, let in most of them, but say not, and then you come up with a reason why some people shouldn't enter the country. The point of a plan-inclusive counterplan, first, it takes out a lot of the AF impacts, hopefully all of them, and it focuses the debate on a single question, hopefully an indefensible one, if your counterplan is good enough. So if you think they're going to have a really hard time explaining why, you know, like serial abusers shouldn't go to jail, you read the PIC and you're like, wow, you're really going to make serial abusers not go to jail? How dare you? And you focus the round just around that. Now, the sort of legislative model of debate defense of these PICs is the sort of amendment type process. So in Congress, if we're going to pass a bill, somebody might say, yeah, sure, I'm okay with passing this bill, but we need to amend this provision. That's kind of what you're doing with a plan-inclusive counterplan. You're doing almost all of the AF, but you're talking about the one part of it that you're like, no, we need to fix that. So picks can be incredibly powerful, especially when they're specific to AFs. And, you know, they're quite effective. If you can come up with good ones, it will do you well. The next type of counterplan is the sort of consult condition-y type of counterplan. So this is a form of counterplan where it says, do the affirmative team's plan if and only if condition or until condition. So this doesn't really make any sense on our criminal justice topic, but a lot of y'all are going to be debating on next year's topic, and hopefully you'll have either the Pakistan topic or the Russia topic, or if you're in the future, maybe you've got a foreign policy topic of your own. Say you are cooperating with Russia on something, but you're worried about, you know, how the Ukraine is going to feel. You could say, consult Ukraine, and if the Ukraine is okay with the plan, we'll do the plan. And if they're not, we won't. So these are sort of sleazy, because they do basically the whole plan. They just add a consultation. The argument is often that the reason these are mutually exclusive is because the affirmative team's plan for sure happens, and the negative team's counterplan might happen, and that sureness is where you get the competition. Yeah, again, this is a little bit sleazy, but they can be incredibly powerful. I know we had the arms sales topic last year, and conditions counterplans that were like, you know, end arms sales unless this happens, or if this happens, end arms sales. Those were incredibly powerful, especially on foreign policy topics. So you'll have to look into, you know, exactly how to do this in a way that is not going to get you yelled at. One thing I found, especially when running these in sort of lay situations where they seem potentially illegitimate, even if you think you've got the theory debate down pat, is that it's important to emphasize the importance of the distinction you're making. So if you're saying, no, don't just get rid of arms sales, instead condition arms sales, you need to talk a lot about how that's a core debate in the literature. That in the think tanks that worry about arms sales, those are the kind of debates that they have. If you can prove that you're having an important discussion, judges are a lot more likely to take you seriously. So consult conditions, make sure you know what you're doing. But if you do know what you're doing and you're on a foreign policy topic, they're incredibly powerful. Next, let's talk about two types of counterplans that aren't that good, but are fun. They're a little bit weird, but they're not like cheating. Something like a uniqueness counterplan. So you'll probably never need this. But let's say you got this great disad and you're like, this is amazing. The plan totally links. I've only got this one issue, and it's that the disad is totally non-unique. If you don't know what that means, go back, listen to the disad lecture. Some people argue that you run a counterplan that provides uniqueness to the disad. So if the disad is like, I don't know, we're going to prevent like a nuclear war, but for some reason you think that a nuclear war is a terrible example. How about climate change? So the climate change disad, you could be like, the plan totally screws up the climate change bad, but oops, it's not unique, the climate is already screwed up. So you read a uniqueness counterplan that fixes the climate, and then you read the disad. Again, weird, not that helpful, but you know, you can look into it more if you have a disad, but it doesn't have any uniqueness. The next type of this sort of weird, not that helpful, but not cheating counterplan is the polarized counterplan. That's a catch-all term for basically do the opposite of what the AF wants to do. They say increase STEM funding, I say decrease STEM funding. They say reduce arms sales, I say increase arms sales. And this is when you want to make the debate about sort of an ideological question. So perhaps on the criminal justice reform topic, this could be focusing the debate around the benefit of law enforcement versus law enforcement being bad, right? If you think that you're really good at like defending the police, maybe that's the kind of thing you want to do. And you're like, decriminalize drugs, more like criminalize drugs 10 times as much. So you'll see there's a reason why people often don't do these, because normally the topics are in the direction of what you want to be doing. And there aren't very many people who are really happy to defend the absolute opposite. They're more popular on foreign policy topics where it's less clear that the opposite of what the AF wants to do is just like racism. So polarized CPs, maybe you can use them next year. They're not that helpful. Next, some illegitimate counterplans. You might think that they're fun, but a lot of people not big fans. One example is the delay counterplan. This is like do the plan, but later. It's big around elections when you're like, okay, so I've got my elections dised. It only happens until November. So run the elections dised and run a delay counterplan, which is like counterplan, do the plan after the elections. Very sleazy. It only competes because the argument is that the resolved implies now. It's a bad argument. Don't read a delay counterplan. If somebody argues a delay counterplan against you, well, we'll talk about perms later, but say perm and you can perm it. Don't let them define resolved on you. And then object counterplans. Object counterplans are when you sort of fiat the object of an advantage rather than an actor. So if there's something like, we're trying to stop war with Russia or something like that, you could be like counterplan, like Russia doesn't declare war on the United States, or Russia doesn't go to war with the United States. Or, great example, last year on the arms sales topic with the war in Yemen, you could be like counterplan, Saudis and the Yemenis should make peace. Like, clearly, it makes sense that these are just really cheating. It really exploits the fact that there isn't a set actor for the negative team. They can act through the courts, they can act through the states, etc., etc. Often, this is also foreign actor fiat, which people argue about whether or not it's okay. Can my counterplan act through Canada? Maybe it can. But object counterplans, they sort of fiat the impact itself, which is not considered okay. So that's a brief overview of a lot of different types of counterplans. There are absolutely more, but I think that is plenty for now. So next, let's talk about answering a counterplan. So the first part of answering a counterplan is a perm. Perms test competition of a counterplan by posing a question. Is the plan plus any amount of the counterplan better than the counterplan on its own? Let me say that one more time. Is the plan plus any amount of the counterplan better than the counterplan on its own? If the answer to that question is yes, you win the perm. You've proved that the counterplan is not competitive with the affirmative and therefore is not a reason to vote neg. Winning the perm beats the counterplan. So let's talk about exactly why this is. So if the negative team wanted to, just read anything. They could be counterplan, give everybody a puppy, right? That's just so clearly good, right? Everybody wants a puppy. But the point of a perm is to test the competition of giving everybody a puppy. So you could say, perm, do our plan and give everybody a puppy. That does all of your plan plus any amount of the counterplan, and it's better than the counterplan on its own as long as you've won the AF, right? Let's say they're like, okay, I see what you're doing. Counterplan, don't do the plan, and give everybody a puppy. Now it's mutually exclusive, and great benefit, everybody gets a puppy. That's where the plan plus any amount of the counterplan. You don't need to include the whole counterplan. So you could be like, perm, do the affirmative team's plan, and do the part of the counterplan that gives everybody a puppy. Don't do the part of the counterplan that just doesn't do our AF, right? So competition needs to actually be an intrinsic part of the counterplan, or else you can't get rid of it. Now, there are two main rules. They've sort of already been explained, but the perm needs to include the entirety of the affirmative team's plan. If you don't, it's called severance. Generally, it's considered illegitimate. And a perm cannot include anything more than the plan and any or all of the counterplan. So a perm that does that would be called intrinsic, also illegitimate. For example, if I go, plan end arms sales to Saudi Arabia, you go counterplan, provide foreign aid to Yemen. I couldn't say like, perm, end arms sales to Saudi Arabia, provide foreign aid to Yemen, and reassure Saudi Arabia that we're not going to abandon our alliance or whatever. That's adding something extra that was not in the counterplan or the plan. That's not allowed. So let's talk about different types of perms. So the biggest perm, if you don't know a perm to make this perm is great. Do both. Does all the counterplan, does all the plan. Use it against most things, states, courts, especially actor counterplans, which is most of what happens. So they go, we like your plan, but we think the states should do it. And we're like, I like your counterplan. I think we all should do it. The federal government can do the plan. The states can do the plan. There's no reason why they can't do it together. And maybe you talk about how, that cooperation is just fantastic. You want to explain why the negative counterplan also links to the disad when you're making this argument, because the disad is what provides the net benefit. So why can't you do both things at the same time? Remember, they're probably not mutually exclusive. If they are, perm do both is not going to be great. They're probably relying on a net benefit, a disad, that links to the plan but not the counterplan. If you prove that the disad links to both the plan and the counterplan, then suddenly answering the question is pretty easy. That yes, doing both the plan and the counterplan is better than just doing the counterplan, because they both have a disad negative consequence, but the plan provides extra solvency to the perm. Okay, so perm do both. That's your strongest one. If they're using a net benefit, but they're not mutually exclusive, that's almost always what you want to do. Next, do the AF and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the counterplan. This is pretty good against those sort of like list counterplans that are like, reform XYZ issue in like 3 or 4 different ways, and maybe some of them are mutually exclusive and some aren't. So you say, perm, do the affirmative team's plan in all non-mutually exclusive parts of the counterplan. A slight addendum to that, you can do the AF and choose specific parts of the counterplan. This is like sort of slightly more impressive than just saying all non-mutually exclusive parts, but you could pick which planks you want to use. Next, there's do the counterplan and do the AF, both of which are kind of bad. So do the counterplan is almost always severance. That means it's getting rid of part of the plan. Often, if you're saying do the counterplan, you're just trying to show that the counterplan is the plan plus something else. But generally, perm do both works just as well in that situation. But that's the kind of thing you would say against like a delay counterplan. You could be like, come on, the delay counterplan includes the entirety of my AF. Do the AF, don't say that, just, yeah. Okay, those are the main types of perms. Remember, your perm must answer the question, is the plan plus any amount of the counterplan better than the counterplan on its own? However, perms are not an advocacy. So after you've won a perm, you still have to win that your plan is actually good in order to win the round. You're not defending the perm as a new advocacy. Next thing for the AF to do. Always remember to argue that the counterplan links to a disad. Even if your perm stuff is all messed up, still argue that, because it provides the counterplan a lot less weight and the disad a lot less weight if those things don't work together. Next, really important part is solvency. As the affirmative team, you need to attack the solvency of the counterplan. In particular, you want to say that the counterplan does not solve the affirmative team's impacts. Here are some common ways that people do that. First, there's sort of like jurisdiction/wrong actor arguments. This is good against states counterplan, courts counterplan, etc. Hopefully, in your 1ACs, after you've listened to this lecture, you'll begin to work in solvency arguments about why your actor is the best one. So in our 1033 AF this year, it's a federal program that's militarizing the police. We say get rid of it at the federal level. If they say the states should do it, we're like, sorry, 1033 program is not a state program. They can't. They don't have the jurisdiction. So that's a common argument. You want to be able to defend your actor. Next is a circumvention argument. This is the sort of like maybe states are racist type argument. If they're trying to make the states do your criminal justice reform, you're like, can we really trust the states to do it? Here's why the federal government is better. Text wording. You can attack the wording of the counterplan. Chances are they wrote it in like 10 seconds after they saw what your app was. It's probably poorly written. And you can exploit that to your advantage. We feel kind of bad about this, but Grace and I, we hit a team and they read a counterplan that instead of just saying that states would refuse funding to militarize police from the federal government, they accidentally said that states would refuse all federal funding. So we're like, okay, if you're getting rid of all federal funding, what about COVID relief? What about, disaster management? And we're like, yeah, that's not a good idea. So look at the wording of their counterplan text and be like, it's bad. Next, you should always cross-apply their attacks on your solvency and explain why they apply better to the counterplan. You'll have to know your AF pretty well to do this, but it's a good idea. And then finally, specifics. Just like if you're preparing against an affirmative, prepare against counterplans. Have your 3 favorite reasons why the court's counterplan sucks, your 5 favorite reasons why the state's counterplan sucks, etc., and be ready to, hit them with the, counterplan doesn't solve, courts don't work, courts are bad, nobody follows the courts. You read those cards, they're doomed. Okay, so solvency. You prove that the counterplan does not solve the AF. And finally, offense. So just like you can read offense against a affirmative team's plan, you can read it against a counterplan. So you can argue that the disad, means the counterplan's a bad idea. You can turn the counterplan. Run them if you can. It's always good to have a couple of these. The hollow hope disad, it's a disad against courts specifically. They read a court's counterplan, read the hollow hope disad. Suddenly it makes it a lot more fair of a round because it sort of equalizes the idea that the negative team has an advantage, right? They solve your impacts and they have a disad that links to your version, but not their version. That's the point of reading the counterplan. If you then read a disad to their counterplan, well, now it's suddenly just impact weighing again, right? You're weighing the impact of your disad against the impact of their disad, and hopefully you know how to make that win. So, perm, link, solvency, offense. Perm, link, solvency, offense. Those are the most important things to do when you're answering a counterplan. If you are in a flow round, or if you think your opponents don't know how to lay debate, but you're in a lay round, you can argue about theory. Often this is like condo bad, picks bad, actor counterplans bad. There are all sorts of theoretical reasons why any type of counterplan is illegitimate and should not be accepted. It's really not important in ESMO, like almost ever. We're not going to really go over it in this lecture. There is going to be a theory lecture where we will talk about all of this. But come on, you really don't need this. It's mostly just there to waste people's time. But again, we'll talk about all of this in a dedicated theory lecture. So thank you all for coming. I hope this was helpful in understanding counterplans.